Everybody, welcome to this webinar, Dyslexia and Barriers to Reading for Primary School Children. I'm Nicola Romain and I'm National Primary Literacy Advisor here at Pearson. So in this webinar, we will try and define what dyslexia is, explore how dyslexia affects literacy development, uncover how the Simple View of Reading model can help teachers to identify barriers to reading, look at some interventions that can make a difference to children with dyslexia, and then question-wise, if you pop any questions that you may have into the Q&A during the course of the webinar, then we will gather those up and send you the answers to any questions that you may have as a follow-up, along with the recording of this webinar itself. So let's get started. So a quote there, first of all, from Marianne Wolf, who is a prolific researcher of reading and a neuroscientist, and who is quoted in the reading framework and whose work I've followed for quite a long time. So well worth looking at her work if you can. So as adults, reading has become automatic and effortless for most of us. We're not usually conscious of the huge amount of processing our brains do when we read, unless something happens to draw it to our attention, such as when we turn over 2 pages at once and realise that the part sentence at the top of the following page makes no sense. So as you can see from that quote, Marianne Wolf has described our brain's speedy processing as we read the black marks on the page and the impact that this has. She explains that when we start to read without a single moment of conscious awareness, our eyes sweep systematically across the page, making small movements which allow our brain to take in about 7 letters or letter spaces at once. And as a result of these, we're already previewing and starting to process what we will read a millisecond later. And as highly skilled readers, we automatically associate specific letters with specific sounds and specific letter patterns with specific words. And while our brain is gathering this visual information, it's sending it to its language areas for processing. And as soon as that happens in the next millisecond, we start to take in the text's meaning, implications, and nuances, and we generate inferences and hypotheses. And we're constantly predicting automatically, without us knowing, what may be coming next. We draw on what we already know and adjust those ideas as we absorb new information. So knowledge, both from our reading and from real life, feeds into this new reading. And if we forget what just happened or want to check something, our eyes know automatically to flip back quickly to pick up the information that we need. So for us as fluent readers, all this happens unconsciously. So let's have a look now in a bit more detail at how the reading brain works before we have an opportunity to kind of evaluate what happens when there are barriers to learning to read. So learning to read involves a complicated process of rewiring specific areas in the brain in order to turn the shapes of letters into sounds and words of spoken language. On the screen there, you can see Stanislas Dehaene, another prolific researcher and scientist who studies how reading takes place in the brain, and he's a professor at the Collège de France. He studies the neurofunctions of the brain and high-level functions such as reading. Watching the brain at work requires precision scanning instruments, sort of MRI scans, and carefully designed experiments. So typically these would include using real words and pseudo words to formulate that kind of reaction in the brain. So from the brain's point of view, according to Stanislas, learning to read consists of, firstly, recognizing the letters and how they combine into written words, and secondly, connecting them to the brain systems for coding of speech sounds and for meaning. And you can see that quote there on the slide. That's also Stanislas Dehaene, who talks about expert reading depending on a fortuitous combination of cerebral connections that luckily pre-exist in our primate brains and take years of training to convert to a new use. One mishap in the circuitry is enough to bring the fragile process of neuronal recycling to a grinding halt. And I think that's really important to remember, that it can just be one mishap, one element of learning to read. If that's broken down or doesn't work properly, then it can really, really affect that reading progress. We've come, as I say, such a long way in understanding what happens in the brain when we learn to read. And thanks to imaging technology and groundbreaking research, this really helps us as professionals, as educators, to understand the barriers that may occur to reading better than ever before, better than anybody who's gone before us. And we're in such a strong position to make a difference to these children that have those dyslexic tendencies or barriers. So reading starts in your brain like any other visual stimulation. So in the general visual areas of the occipital pole of the brain, but then that very quickly moves into an area which concerns the recognition of the written word. And Professor Dehaene calls this area the brain's letterbox because it is where we store our knowledge of letters. And from there, it's an explosion of activity into at least two brain networks, one that concerns the meaning of the words and another that concerns the pronunciation and the articulation of those words. So the brain builds on the circuits that we initially trained for spoken language. So to learn the alphabet, first a human must learn to speak. And evolution has hardwired the brain for spoken language. However, as we know, an increasing number of children are coming to school with that low level of spoken language, which in turn impacts their ability to learn to read. The centrality of spoken language to children's attainment and life chances must be recognised as part of any efforts to recover children's education following the pandemic and help build that up again. And finally, addressing that negative impact of poorer spoken language that has existed for far too long, especially in the areas of social disadvantage. The stark reality is that poorer language means poorer outcomes, and poor language skills at age 5 affects reading and numeracy at age 11. So evolution has never shaped the brain to read. So the brain recycles so existing functions. So for example, the circuits that recognize faces are turned into circuits to recognize letters. And the information about letters is then brought into the circuits used for spoken language. It's also very clever. The brain knows about the pronunciation of words, and the challenge for beginner readers is to turn the letters into sounds. Some children struggle more with turning those letters into sounds, as we know, something that expert readers do automatically. So a teaching method where children are taught to read whole words might not be helpful for many children. And neither is it the case that by exposing children to words and books alone, that they will become skilled readers, albeit that is so important in addition to explicit teaching. An abundance of research tells us that it is by explicitly teaching the correspondences between letters and sounds that is the right way to teach reading. And that is, of course, systematic synthetic phonics, teaching those circuits that go directly from vision to spoken language. So drawing attention to whole words is using a whole different circuit in the brain altogether. So a number of brain regions are involved in reading and comprehension. So among them are the temporal lobe, which is responsible for the phonological awareness and for decoding and discriminating sounds. The Broca's area in the frontal lobe governs speech production and language comprehension, and the angular and supramarginal gyrus, which link different parts of the brain so that letter shapes can be put together to form words. So we look at the left hemisphere in green and orange on the slide. Here are the areas of the brain that are wired for speech and language, and then the red and the blue are wired for reading and writing. So for dyslexic children, those red and blue aren't there naturally. We have to build those networks for those children. So thinking back to that systematic, explicit instruction, and we have to build those networks for those children through careful, explicit, systematic and considered teaching. Dr. Mark Seidenberg clarifies that the hallmark of skilled reading is the integration of print with what a person knows about the spoken language, again reinforcing that fact that spoken language is absolutely key and paramount to children's future learning to read abilities. So Dyslexia Awareness Week has been between the 2nd and the 8th of October, and Dyslexia Awareness Month falls in October every year. And it's the time of year when we focus on promoting, gives us an opportunity to step back and focus on promoting a more accessible and inclusive world for people with dyslexia and low literacy, as well as celebrating dyslexic excellence, of course. It's an opportunity to celebrate neurodiversity in general as well. And it's a whole landscape of neurodiversity awareness initiatives that run in the month of October. And if we take a look now at the dyslexic brain, so we've seen earlier on the benefit of imaging technology and how that allows us to look inside the brain and how it learns to read. So here we can see the brain of a child who's a typical reader and how the brain of a child with dyslexia is activated during those different processes. So I spoke earlier on about using techniques such as real words and pseudo words for this kind of process. So what you see in the brain of a child with dyslexic tendencies is that by and large, they've got trouble processing the smallest units of sound, so phonemes. So there's also a delay with which the speed of the different processes associated with reading come together. So what do we do? So first and foremost, armed with this knowledge, we need to acknowledge what makes the dyslexic brain different. We can see that visually on the screen there. They're not as activated, those really important parts of the brain. It's our responsibility to use the knowledge that we have and the research that we've got to address how to teach these children to read. And this is the point of all of this presentation of different types of research. And on this slide is just some clarity around what dyslexia is, and the fact that it's a brain-based learning disability that specifically impairs a person's ability to read. And there is mention there of the fact that children born with the neurological impairments associated with dyslexia are more likely than other children to have family members with the impairment. And there's an awful lot of research around that as well. So that's really, really interesting to find out what those sort of genetic connections are. The British Dyslexia Association tells us that 10% of the population are believed to be dyslexic, but it is still often poorly understood. And then the latest data from the government, again, the British Dyslexia Association, as I say, estimates that approximately 10% of the UK population has dyslexia, but 4% of that 10% are severely dyslexic. And you can see here on the screen that over 1 million pupils in schools in England currently have an SEND without an education, health and care plan. And that's an increase of 87,000 since 2022. So you can see that there is more identification, more prevalence, more awareness of these reading barriers. So dyslexia is a learning difficulty characterised by challenges in reading and spelling, despite adequate learning opportunities, and in the absence of other cognitive or sensory disabilities such as ADHD or visual impairment. So whilst there's a general consensus on the reading deficit experienced by individuals with dyslexia, there are some misconceptions surrounding its underlying causes, and assessment, identification and intervention strategies persist. So things like, and as I say, I don't want you to take this as me saying that these sort of previously typical tendencies around dyslexia are not true. What I'm saying is that we have to evaluate each case by its own merit and take on the research as well, and kind of evaluate how we're kind of perceiving children with these reading barriers in the light of sort of the most recent research that's available to us. So letter reversals. So professionals surveyed in a recent study believed that dyslexia is characterised by reading letters in reverse order. And I would say that's a commonly thought of fact. So 61% of these people, or seeing letters jump around at 33% of the people surveyed thought that. So the research shows us that letter reversals are more closely related to a specific stage of reading development, and that would be around up to the age of 7 or 8 years, where letter reversals are prevalent in children without dyslexia as well, rather than being exclusive to dyslexia itself. So studies have found no significant differences in the occurrence of letter reversals between dyslexic and non-dyslexic individuals. Interestingly, creativity. So 17% of the professionals surveyed associated dyslexia with high levels of creativity. But a recent meta-analysis comparing creativity levels in dyslexia and non-dyslexic children found no significant differences. So creativity isn't necessarily a defining characteristic of dyslexia. Motor skills difficulties or clumsiness. So 17% of the survey participants believe that being clumsy or having motor skill difficulties is an indicator of dyslexia. Past studies have reported no motor skill difficulties between children with dyslexia when compared to their typically developing peers. And then coloured overlays, which I'm sure we've all used, I certainly have done. 15% of the professionals surveyed believe that dyslexic children struggle with reading when text is displayed on certain coloured backgrounds. However, a systematic review concluded that there is no evidence supporting the use of coloured overlays or coloured lenses to improve reading skills in students with dyslexia. And then specific dyslexia fonts. And this isn't to say that all children with these tendencies don't have these typical or things that we thought were typical kind of issues. It means that we need to evaluate each case. So another misconception held by 12% of the survey participants is the belief that all dyslexic children face difficulties when reading text in specific text fonts. And experimental studies have failed to demonstrate any additional benefits of dyslexic-friendly fonts over commonly used fonts, such as Arial or Times New Roman, in improving reading skills for children with dyslexia. So in the pursuit of a better understanding, and that's what we're doing, that's what we're hoping to do in this webinar, a better understanding of dyslexia, debunking prevailing misconceptions assumes great significance, and the emphasis lies on highlighting these misconceptions and their lack of empirical support, I guess, with the ultimate goal of promoting informed and evidence-based practices in dyslexia assessment and intervention. And then a new study in support of early diagnosis, and again, a tool that you can use in order to observe the children in your setting that you feel that, that are on your radar. A new article co-authored by Professor of Neurogenetics Silvia Paracchini, and again, I will reference this in the follow-up email, has identified an association between dyslexia and mixed-handedness. And in the context of the study, mixed-handedness refers to an umbrella term comprising both ambidexterity, so no hand preference within a task, and inconsistent hand use. So that would be using different hands across different activities. And the authors of the study, including Paracchini, were surprised to find a robust link between dyslexia and mixed-handedness rather than left-handedness in light of previous theories hypothesizing that relationship. So the results stem from the researchers' systematic review and meta-analysis of all available literature on dyslexia and handedness. So the 68 studies identified featured data from more than 45,000 individuals, allowing for more reliable and precise findings on the potential relationship between the two variables. So it's definitely a strong study, and such studies contribute to a clearer understanding for educators of potential differences between individuals with dyslexia and control participants. And they in turn can facilitate crucial early diagnosis and intervention, if you know what you're looking out for children with this learning disability. So that's really useful as well, a really new piece of evidence. And here is a quote on the screen, I won't read it to you, from Jim Rose, and it is the general steer from the DFE and the government around dyslexia, which reinforces what we know, what we've heard about earlier on in the webinar around the fact that dyslexia primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. So what are the implications for dyslexia in summary? So that children with dyslexia's brains are less active in the left hemisphere where language is processed. That is the area that needs the work, the training, and the kind of the close look at those skills in that area of the brain. When doing a task that involves reading or manipulating phonemes, those parts of the brain are underactivated. But the area of the brain that helps us understand how words are made up of sounds and how we map sounds to print are most affected. And in children with dyslexia, the area of the brain that helps us recognize words by sight and becomes automatic in skilled readers is weakened or weaker. And children with dyslexia's brains are overactive in other areas of the brain to compensate. So how do we identify and support children with barriers to reading? So discovering the true nature of dyslexia and navigating its unique challenges starts with understanding its prevalence and its impact on our society. And again, we take this research and we evaluate that research in the light of our setting and the children with these kind of issues that we're concerned about. So we know that you can see the simple view of reading on the slide there. We know that struggling readers don't catch up without intervention. So what tools can we use in school to help us identify children's reading profiles and flag any barriers early on? So let's start by revisiting the simple view of reading, first developed by Go and Tunma in 1986, but then used in the Rose Review of 2006. And of course, it's prevalent in the reading framework documents, both of 2021 and the revised version of 2023, published in July. It's been fundamental this model's been fundamental in changing the debate about the teaching of reading over the last 20 years. And it's frequently shown as a diagram consisting of 2 axes and 4 quadrants, which is what you can see on the slide there. So reading's been described as the product of decoding and comprehension. So we have a horizontal axis, as you can see, for word reading, which is decoding, and a vertical axis for language comprehension processes. And the national curriculum programmes of study for reading reflect this model, of course, presented as 2 dimensions, which are word reading and comprehension. So let's think about language comprehension first of all. So comprehension itself doesn't refer to reading itself, but rather the way in which we make sense of words, sentences, and the wider language we hear or read. So language, as we know, develops through interaction with others. And inevitably, by the time they start school, some children understand more and know more words than others because of the quantity and quality of the interactions they've already had with adults before they've started school. So children who begin school with a poor understanding of language will need considerable support to develop their spoken language, if necessary, throughout their school years. And decoding refers to reading unfamiliar words, so words that haven't been read before, by saying the sounds corresponding to the letters in the words and then blending the sounds together, either aloud or silently. So reading familiar words accurately and silently at a glance, so no longer saying the words consciously. And in contrast to spoken language, most written language, is a relatively recent cultural invention. And we heard earlier on about spoken language being hardwired in the brain. So most children do not develop the ability to read without direct teaching. And for children who begin school with that poor understanding of language, being able to decode words is essential for equality, because their understanding of language, their vocabulary, and their knowledge of the world will expand rapidly when they can read for themselves, which opens doors to them. So we can acknowledge then that children need both good language comprehension and good word reading to become skilled readers. So what are the implications of the model for beginner readers? So word reading and language comprehension require different sorts of teaching. When children start learning to read, the number of words that they can decode accurately is too limited to broaden their vocabulary. So their understanding of language should therefore be developed through their listening and speaking, while they're taught to decode through phonics. So that's through discussion and talk and reading aloud to them. And we see all of these things coming through strongly in the reading framework guidance of 2023. However, when they can read most words at a glance and can decode unfamiliar words easily, they're free then to think about the meaning of what they read, and they can begin to develop their understanding of language through their own reading as well as through their listening. So there's a shift. And the implication of the simple view of reading model for more experienced readers, so once pupils can decode accurately and speedily, reading a lot is the principal way they develop as readers. And we hear about the reading miles in the reading framework document as well. And putting in the reading miles allows pupils to practice their reading, building experience with increasingly complex texts and encountering new knowledge, gaining new language, including vocabulary, and they're developing their fluency. So over the course of year 2 and into Key Stage 2, The focus of the teaching of reading therefore shifts from decoding towards ensuring pupils get this print experience and support with spoken language, both through teacher-led reading sessions and independent reading. And then as their decoding skills become increasingly secure, teaching should be directed more towards developing their vocabulary and the breadth and depth of their exposure to different texts. And then we have another model for skilled reading, which is based on a simple view of reading, which is Scarborough's reading rope. As I say, it's another way of looking at the simple view of reading and detail. What can this tell us? How can this model inform reading barriers? It goes into a bit more detail than the simple view itself. It's a metaphor for learning to read. It's a rope, and the end point of that rope is skilled reading. And then over on that left-hand side, we can see language comprehension and word recognition split down into its component parts. And that many strands, an acknowledgement that many strands are woven into skilled reading, and that they become increasingly automatic and increasingly strategic with teaching, with systematic instruction and practice. And if any of these strands are broken, or there is a barrier to any of those strands, then skilled reading will be affected and impaired. So this is a really good tool also to help inform our sort of teaching when we're evaluating all of those skills required for skilled reading. And of course, it's our job as educators to make the connections that we've just seen on Scarborough's reading rope there, those foundational skills for the youngest of children as soon as they start school. So we've got phonemic awareness and orthographic awareness, semantic knowledge, syntactic knowledge, morphological knowledge, and understanding alphabetic principle. And all of these elements are crucial to oral language, but they're also essential for learning to read, and we bring them together. That's our role. So we need to teach children to make the connections so that they become automatic for them, as per the Scarborough's reading rope. The alphabetic principle is at the core of those foundational skills, and it's connected to all of the others. And we've got to embed these with all children in order to achieve deep reading. And the reading brain teaches us that those foundational skills are all important. We can see that. We saw that in that infographic of the reading brain earlier on. It's widely acknowledged that most children need explicit, systematic instruction on those foundational skills in order to embed them and make expected progress. So, as we've established, dyslexia is a specific learning difficulty that primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent reading and spelling. And the DFE have specific measures in place to identify pupils who are facing challenges with reading and literacy and to help teachers understand how to support them. And the most recent guidance is obviously in the reading framework document. The framework itself is non-programme specific. It provides high quality guidance. It's a meaty document, and it provides that high quality guidance for foundational literacy based on a combination of research findings and classroom experience. It facilitates the notion of high quality systematic synthetic phonics and accompanying reading books. So that's that decodable reading books and training for that for embedding that foundational literacy and the assessments associated with that practice as being the way to identify children with barriers to reading. So one key recommendation in the framework relates to procedures to prevent dyslexia developing. So the framework states that children who show early evidence of struggling with learning to read should be identified as early as 3 weeks of starting their phonics instruction and immediately started on extra teaching and practice with the same programme in order to keep up with the other children in their class. And according to one of the research reports quoted in the framework, Marilyn Grant, who wrote The Effects of a Systematic Synthetic Phonics Programme on Reading, Writing and Spelling, a child who struggles with learning to read is unlikely to be alone in their class. The research study found that between 5 to 9% of each reception cohort made virtually no progress with reading and spelling by the January of reception against a backdrop of the rest of the cohorts of about 90 children who were reading and spelling about a year above their chronological age. So at this point, schools may be tempted to say that these children need a different way of learning to read because of their lack of progress, but the evidence doesn't support that view. And instead, the small groups of struggling children were found to be responsive to light touch, small group, extra systematic synthetic phonics teaching and practice. And the groups of struggling children caught up and exceeded age expectations for both reading and spelling by the end of the reception year. And I can send you that report in the follow-up email. So that is what has been missing, is that early identification and immediate extra small group teaching for these slow to start children so that they can keep up with their peers. So the solution isn't about necessarily diagnosing dyslexia, but in prevention of dyslexia developing by early identification, or really mitigating dyslexia from developing further. And that identification of difficulties and appropriate intervention very early on. So there's a quote from the DFE's reading framework for you. And then just a little bit around this systematic synthetic phonics approach as the key route to success. So evidence shows that teaching phonics is the best way to teach children to read words. We've got convincing evidence to the value of SSPs. For example, the Clackmannanshire study, the Clackmannanshire report, which I will also send to you in the follow-up. International recognition, and also that consistency of the English language being represented in that alphabetic code. And that's non-negotiable. That's for all children, and the barriers that may occur for some children because of that English alphabetic code. Okay, so we have here on the slide that acknowledgement as well from the reading framework that some pupils need extra support from the beginning, and that assessments should identify such pupils. So the rigour of assessments for those children, if not already identified, as soon as they begin to fall behind their peers. So we talked about sort of 3 weeks into reception from in their phonics teaching, that we should be identifying children that aren't making expected progress. If that hasn't happened, then later on, as soon as they begin to fall behind their peers, we should be identifying those children through assessments. And it talks about individual records of progress there, so that we can really pinpoint children at risk of not meeting the expected standard of the phonics screening check, for example, and then failing to learn to read, and then obviously entering Key Stage 3 in secondary school, not being able to access the full secondary curriculum, which obviously is the risk factor here as well. So I think we can say with conviction that teachers change the brains of children as we teach them to read. So where children struggle to learn to read, the brain needs to be trained more intensively through intervention in order to produce that behaviour. There's a lot of talk currently about the dyslexia paradox, that when dyslexia is diagnosed, usually after repeated failure in learning to read, usually after year 2, and usually a lot later than that. But research shows that the optimal time for intervention is much earlier than that, usually reception or even earlier. And that's the dyslexia paradox, because diagnosis and intervention usually happen too late. So as educators, we need to be armed from the get-go with tools to help us diagnose, flag issues, and intervene. And this is about an awareness of sort of the most recent research and evidence. We know that dyslexia and other barriers to reading go a long way to reduce self-esteem, causing higher anxiety and lower reading motivation. So the longer we leave children in the paradox, the gap widens, and the Matthew effect, which is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, affects reading. So children who usually start nursery with vocabulary with around 10,000 words. Before then, vocabulary is learned from the environment, and between reception and the end of primary, vocabulary is mostly acquired from reading the texts that they read. So struggling readers read a lot less, which causes less vocabulary, which leads to issues with comprehension. So back to intervention, research tells us that intervention is most effective early. So in reception and year 1 are the absolute optimal times for this. So think about that paradox again. We're not talking about diagnosing dyslexia at that age. We're identifying children who are at a heightened risk to develop dyslexia. It's a risk evaluation. It's important that screeners evaluate phonological awareness, letter sounds and letter names, as well as oral language, vocabulary, and listening comprehension. And learning how the brain develops gives teachers a really good foundation, but it doesn't replace teaching, of course. You can see on the screen then, we have some neuroimages which show that pre-intervention, the only parts of the brain that are highlighted are the language parts of the brain there. So it shows that intervention does really train and grow those parts or enhance the parts of the brain associated in children with dyslexia or dyslexic tendencies. So we've got here on the screen as well. So the question here really is, what evidence-based practices support children with dyslexia? So we've got here a multi-tier system of support, which provides a structure of support for all children in a class. So the green is for all children. And when the teaching of reading is systematic and explicit, 80 to 90% of children should learn to read successfully. That's preventative and proactive. And then screening and assessment will also obviously inform the progress of all children in this band here. And then the yellow tier, so we've got 5 to 10% of children will need additional support based on those assessments that happen in the green tier, and more monitoring. Again, that regular assessment and screening intensifies. So we've got high efficiency and rapid response in that yellow band. And then the red is intensive intervention, so 1 to 5% of pupils. This is variable and can be flipped. So depending on the core instruction as well, more children might be in this band because of the teaching or the instructional model. And in that top tier, it's assessment based and high intensity with kind of a focus on cognitive working as well. So just to capture that again, actually, as well. So for all children, ongoing screening and assessment, explicit systematic instruction and teaching, and a real eye on the intervention model as well, and how specific children are drawn out to have higher intensity intervention for reading. Excuse me. And this is another version, if you like. So children with intensive reading needs, including that lowest 20%, and those in need of individualised intervention should, as I said earlier on in that model, receive explicit systematic instruction across a multi-tiered system. We've got a different version, as I say here. This is increasing intensity across tiers of instruction. We've got, first of all, there, the whole class, 26 children with child 1 and child 2 identified as having the greatest kind of need. And then we've got child 3, 4, and 5 as being on the teacher's radar as well for observation and sort of explicit kind of explicit instruction and clarity in that whole class model. And then we've got the small group then, and they've been pulled out. So we've got child 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They've got differing needs in this group, but they're going to need more explicit and more systematic instruction in a smaller group. And then the third tier, excuse me, is 2 to 1, more explicit cognitive support and more instructional support for executive functioning there. So I think that's a really useful model for teachers to look at what that would look like in practice in a real life sort of whole class situation or setting. And then a myth and a fact. So individuals with dyslexia have the same level of condition severity and experience the same level of difficulties learning to read. A fact is that many individuals, some who have dyslexia and some who don't, experience difficulty learning to read, and individuals with dyslexia differ in severity to more severe forms. So when we're thinking about the intervention model that we're using, it's really important to kind of draw that out as well. And then on this slide, and I will leave you to read this at your leisure, we've got different behavioural characteristics of children with dyslexic tendencies that change as they move up through school. So not using this as a checklist, but keeping an eye out for some of these key features that change as children, as I say, get older and move through school. It's also really important to consider the disconnect between research and practice, if you like. So we've got two different questions on the screen here. What is it about the pupil that makes it difficult for him or her to learn? And what is it about the instruction that makes it difficult for the pupil to learn? So as teachers and educators, following the data, using screening and assessment rigorously, evaluating our own practice, following the science of reading and research and what we know works is really, really valuable and a really, really good starting point. And coming back to those questions time after time is really useful in evaluating progress. Here we've got another infographic, which I think is super useful. It's around those foundational skills and how the emphasis on those skills changes as children not necessarily just move through school, but how their reading proficiency progresses as well. Just the change of emphasis doesn't necessarily mean that older children don't need more intensified support in those foundational skills. So how does the study of the reading brain and dyslexia help all individuals learn to read? We've heard about what connotes dyslexia, and we've evaluated briefly how we can predict its forms before children fail and how we can intervene earlier in a more targeted way. So what will change in a digital culture that we're in now? So Marianne Wolf, who I referenced earlier, continues to actively research both the benefits of predicting reading barriers before children learn to read, but she also brings a critical eye to the threats of digital culture and screen reading. She doesn't suggest that we simply return to print, however. So rather, her goal is to propel research that will help forge a foundation of deep reading that could be used across mediums for all readers in our next generation. And for those of us working with individuals with dyslexia, digital technology, as we know, can sometimes be the best and most important tool we possess in building skills like fluency, engagement, motivation. And this slide just acknowledges the importance also of shared reading and immersing children in vocabulary and language and a rich diet of books, and working with parents as well, so that they are empowered in knowing what the research is around what stimulates patterns of brain development at critical times in child development, which build language, literacy, social emotional skills, and support their reading journey. The SEND Code of Practice is clear that meeting the needs of the pupil with dyslexia does not require a diagnostic label. Instead, the expectation is that teachers monitor the progress of pupils and put support in place where needed. It is acknowledged, however, that diagnostic testing supports teachers and schools in early identification of reading barriers, such as dyslexia. Schools carry out, as we know, a number of standardised assessments to measure progress and help teachers identify where additional support with literacy may be required. And all of these can signpost these issues as well. So things like the phonics screening check and the end of key stage assessments as well can really sort of flag up any early issues. So how can we from Pearson support barriers to reading, such as dyslexia? Well, we have our own systematic phonics programme, Bug Club Phonics, which obviously speaks to the overarching evidence around systematic synthetic phonics from the beginning and its associated assessment and interventions being the way to teach children to read initially. We've also got fully decodable books, fiction and non-fiction, as part of Bug Club Phonics that match every stage of phonics learning, which supports their decoding, but also supports their reading for pleasure and developing their love of reading. We've also got an intervention pathway supporting phonics and fluency called RAPID. We have rapid phonics and rapid reading, and it's an effective intervention for children from year 2 and above. It includes easy to follow lesson plans. Thousands of schools up and down the country use these programs for their struggling readers, including children from disadvantaged backgrounds and those with SEND. As part of the programs, there are decodable high-low readers, and the reading framework does mention high-low readers as important for children who are, need a different context, so a more mature context at a lower reading level. And these books help children to catch up fast. And then we have there just on the slide a bit of a description of rapid phonics and rapid reading. And if you want to know anything more about these products or programs, please do reach out and get in touch with us. As I said earlier on, in that myth busting slide, some children will have issues associated with dyslexia that mean that visual stress is an issue, or font causes confusion. So for those children in our intervention pathway, Books for Rapid, the text is on a cream background to reduce visual stress. And we've got specially designed font, which reduces confusion, but not all children will have those issues. To support you, in addition, we also have the Nelly products. The Nelly programme is the most well-evidenced early language programme available globally, and it consists of an evidence-based language intervention, a whole class enrichment programme complete with an oral language assessment for primary schools, targeted at children who show weakness in their oral language skills, but useful for all. But those children that are at risk of experiencing difficulty in reading comprehension, and the aim is to catch them early. So please do reach out if you'd like any more information around our partnership with Oxford and Assessment and the products associated with that. And then, of course, our wider offering, our book club reading books, support all of the aspects cited in the reading framework around learning to read, fluency, reading miles, comprehension, reading for pleasure, and reading aloud. So please do reach out if you want any more information on those. We currently have a really exclusive 55% off offer for a time limit, for a limited time, on selected titles of decodable reading books and from our Reading for Pleasure library, which is called Book Club Reading Corner. You can see on the slide there the benefit of those books. If you would like to take advantage of that sale to top up your books in school, then please do get in touch as well. And just to finish off from me, please do feel free to make an appointment to discuss your school's particular priorities for reading. We've got an active Facebook group called Book Club Literacy Community, which is a collaborative group, and where members do share practice with each other, and there are lots of updates on our products on there too. You are more than welcome to join our primary literacy newsletter mailing list. And just to flag our webinars that we have coming up in the very near future, we have a Beyond Phonics, so from year 2 onwards, what happens next, webinar on the 14th of November. And for our Book Club Phonics users, we have an updating webinar for those users on the 22nd of November. Of course, anybody's welcome to attend that as well. And just to finish off with the quote that there's nothing that plays a greater role in learning to read than a reading ready brain. So being really aware of how the brain learns to read and how the dyslexic child's brain can be slightly different, and what we can do around intervention in order to really train the brain and grow those parts is the kind of key message from me. Thank you ever so much for joining me, and please do get in touch if we can support you in any way.